August 6, 1945, 8:14 a.m., Hiroshima, Japan. The morning air hung thick with humidity, the kind that clung to skin and uniform alike. In the underground command bunker 17 miles north of Hiroshima, Major General Seizo Arisue sat before a field. Telephone, a cup of cold barley tea forgotten at his elbow. The previous night's briefings had been routine. Fuel shortages, troop repositions, the endless calculus of a dying war. Outside, cicadas screamed their summer song, oblivious to the B-29 that had passed over the city moments before. Then, at precisely 8:15 a.m., the telephone line went dead. Not the crackle of damaged wire or the static of interference, but absolute silence. The kind of silence that precedes understanding. 70 seconds earlier, the Enola Gay's bombardier had released a single weapon from 31,000 feet. It fell for 43 seconds, an elongated teardrop of uranium-235 wrapped in steel, tumbling through the summer sky with the inevitability of history itself. The Japanese radar operators had tracked the lone bomber but dismissed it. One plane could do no harm. Their training, their experience, their entire understanding of aerial warfare had taught them this fundamental truth. 3 aircraft might be reconnaissance. A dozen might be a nuisance raid. But one bomber was nothing. They were catastrophically, irrevocably wrong. The flash, what happened next, occurred faster than human comprehension could process. At 1/1968 feet above the Shima Surgical Clinic, the uranium atoms split. In less than a millionth of a second, the temperature at ground zero reached 54 million degrees Fahrenheit, 4 times hotter than the center of the sun. The air itself became incandescent, a sphere of plasma expanding at 2 miles per second. Every organic molecule within a half-mile radius, wood, cloth, paper, flesh, simply ceased to exist, converted instantaneously to carbon and ash. The shadows of human beings were burned into stone walls, photographic negatives etched by light more intense than any star. The shockwave followed milliseconds later, a wall of compressed air moving at 700 miles per hour. It leveled everything: houses, factories, schools, temples. Everything within a 2-mile radius collapsed, as if constructed of paper. The Hiroshima arsenal, the sprawling complex of munitions factories, machine shops, and weapons depots that had supplied the Japanese military for 4 years of war, was obliterated. 1,400 buildings reduced to rubble and twisted steel in less time than it takes to draw breath. The mushroom cloud rose 40,000 feet into the summer sky, visible from islands 60 miles away. But in the bunkers and command posts scattered across southern Japan, there was only silence, broken telephone lines, and the slow, creeping realization that something unprecedented had occurred. The old certainties, to understand what this moment meant to the Japanese High Command, one must first understand what they had believed, with absolute conviction, for 4 years of brutal warfare. Since December 1941, the Imperial Japanese military had operated under a fundamental assumption that war was a contest of will, of spirit, of the samurai code they called Bushido. Material superiority could be overcome by superior dedication. American abundance meant American softness. Their factories might produce more ships, more planes, more bullets, but Japanese soldiers would fight with a ferocity no industrial output could match. This was not merely propaganda. It was doctrine, woven into every tactical manual, every training regimen, every strategic calculation. When General Hideki Tojo addressed the Imperial War Council in 1942, he had spoken of the spiritual advantage that would carry Japan to victory. The Americans, he said, love life too much to die for an abstraction. "We love honor more than life itself." And for a time, it seemed he might be right. At Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers had charged American machine gun positions with bayonets, knowing they would die, choosing death over surrender. At Iwo Jima, 18,000 defenders fought from tunnels and caves, killing nearly 7,000 Americans before the last position fell. On Okinawa, the slaughter had been even worse: 12,000 American casualties, 100,000 Japanese soldiers dead, nearly everyone fighting to the last breath. The kamikazes, young pilots who flew their explosive-laden planes directly into American ships, seemed to confirm the equation. Spirit could overcome matter. Will could defeat steel. But August 6, 1945, shattered this certainty with the force of 1,000 suns. The silence of understanding. When the first reports reached Tokyo 3 hours after the blast, they made no sense. Radio Hiroshima had gone off the air suddenly. Railway communications had ceased. The military telecommunications hub, redundantly protected and considered invulnerable, responded to no signal. Staff officers in the War Ministry called every regional command post within 50 miles of Hiroshima. Most reported seeing a brilliant flash to the southwest, a light so bright it hurt to look at, even from that distance. Some reported a massive explosion. None could explain what had happened. General Arisu, recovered from his initial shock, dispatched reconnaissance aircraft to investigate. The pilots who returned were incoherent. "The city is gone," one captain reported, his voice hollow over the radio. "All of it. There is nothing but smoke and fire. I flew directly over the center. There are no buildings, no streets. Just nothing." His superiors assumed he was exaggerating, mistaken, perhaps injured. They sent more planes. Every pilot reported the same impossible reality. A modern industrial city of 350,000 people had been effectively erased by a single bomb. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, refused to believe the initial reports. "One bomb cannot destroy a city," he said flatly. "It's American psychological warfare. They've dropped hundreds of incendiaries and want us to think it's one weapon." He had seen the firebombing of Tokyo in March, 325 B-29s dropping thousands of bombs over several hours, creating a firestorm that killed 100,000 people. That, he understood. That fit within the known parameters of warfare. But this was impossible, except it wasn't. The arsenal of empire, the Hiroshima arsenal, had been one of the jewels of Japanese military industry. Established in 1903, expanded massively in the 1930s, it produced artillery shells, rifle ammunition, grenades, mortar rounds, the fundamental currency of modern war. Its workshops employed 40,000 workers across dozens of specialized facilities. The main foundry could cast 50 tons of steel per day. The ammunition plants produced 2 million rounds monthly. The quality control laboratories ensured every shell, every bullet, every explosive charge met exacting specifications. Japanese military planners had assumed the arsenal was too large, too dispersed, too hardened to be destroyed by conventional bombing. Even if the Americans dedicated 100 B-29s to the task, even if they achieved perfect bombing accuracy, it would take multiple raids over weeks to seriously damage the complex. And the Americans would lose aircraft, fighters, anti-aircraft fire. The attrition of distance would take their toll. The mathematics of industrial warfare favored the defender. But at 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, mathematics changed its equation. The uranium bomb, which the Americans had codenamed Little Boy, released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. That single weapon exceeded the explosive power of every bomb dropped by every B-29 on every raid over Japan in the previous 6 months, combined. The arsenal, its foundries, its machine shops, its warehouses packed with finished munitions, was vaporized, melted, and scattered across a landscape transformed into something resembling the surface of a dead planet. When Japanese engineers finally reached the outskirts of what had been Hiroshima 3 days later, they found rivers of melted glass where sand had liquefied under the heat, steel I-beams twisted like wire, concrete foundations cracked and split as if made of chalk, and everywhere silence. No birdsong, no insect hum, no sound of human activity, just wind moving through ash. The meeting of August 9. On the morning of August 9th, the Supreme War Council convened in Tokyo. These 6 men, the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Army Minister, Navy Minister, and Chiefs of the Army and Navy General Staffs, had guided Japan's war strategy since 1944. They met in an underground bunker beneath the Imperial Palace, a windowless concrete chamber lit by electric bulbs, insulated from the rubble of Tokyo's burnt-out districts above. The mood was grim, but not yet defeated. Even after Hiroshima, even after the initial reports had been confirmed, the military faction, led by War Minister Korichika Anami, argued for continued resistance. "One city," Anami said. "The Americans have destroyed one city. We have lost cities before. Tokyo burned. Osaka burned. We continue to fight." But there was a new uncertainty in his voice, a hesitation that had not been there before, because everyone in that room understood, even if they could not yet articulate it, that Hiroshima represented something more than destruction. It represented obsolescence. Every calculation, every strategic assumption upon which Japanese resistance was predicated, all of it rendered instantly meaningless by a single weapon. Then, at 11:02 a.m., as the council debated, another flash lit the skies above Nagasaki. Another city, another arsenal, another pocket of industrial capacity essential to Japan's war effort, gone in an instant. This time there was no confusion about what had happened. This time the silence in the bunker was complete. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo spoke first, his voice quiet but steady. "They have more. If they used one bomb on Hiroshima and another on Nagasaki 3 days later, they have more. They will continue until there is nothing left." He was wrong about the numbers. The Americans had, at that moment, no more atomic bombs ready for deployment. But he was absolutely right about the implications. Even if Japan had 1,000 more soldiers willing to die for the emperor, even if every citizen from Hokkaido to Kyushu pledged their lives to the defense of the homeland, what did it matter against a weapon that could erase cities from existence? What did will matter against physics? What did spirit matter against uranium? The weight of the unseen, there is a peculiar horror in being rendered obsolete, in discovering that the rules by which you've structured your entire existence no longer apply. Japanese military philosophy had been built on centuries of tradition, on a warrior culture that valued honor above survival, courage above pragmatism. The samurai code, the way of the warrior, the willingness to face death without flinching, these were not abstractions. They were the foundation of Japanese military identity, and in one blinding flash, they became irrelevant. A soldier can charge a machine gun nest. He will likely die, but his courage has meaning. His sacrifice has purpose. A pilot can fly his plane into an enemy ship, can transform his body into a weapon, can trade his life for strategic gain. But how does one charge an atomic bomb? How does courage answer a weapon that strikes from 6 miles up, moving faster than sound, killing faster than thought? How does will overcome a force that literally rips apart the fabric of matter itself? In the days following Nagasaki, as radiation sickness began to manifest among the survivors of Hiroshima, the horror deepened. Japanese doctors encountered injuries they had never seen, could not understand, could not treat. Patients who had been kilometers from the blast center, who showed no external wounds, began to bleed from their gums, their eyes, their intestines. Their hair fell out in clumps. Their bone marrow ceased producing blood cells. They died slowly, over days or weeks, from an invisible poison that had entered their bodies in that first microsecond of light. Colonel Oya Fumio, a medical officer who entered Hiroshima on August 10th, wrote in his field journal, "This is not warfare. This is the end of warfare. This is something else entirely, something for which we have no name." The abundance of annihilation, the atomic bomb was, in a terrible sense, the ultimate expression of American industrial power. For 4 years, Japanese propaganda had mocked American abundance as weakness. They pointed to the comfort of American soldiers, the supplies that followed them, the Liberty ships and cargo planes that kept them fed, clothed, and armed even in the remotest Pacific islands. Soft, the Japanese called them, dependent on their machines and their luxuries. But Hiroshima revealed the dark side of that abundance. The Manhattan Project, the secret program that developed the atomic bomb, had cost $2 billion, employed 130,000 people, and consumed more electricity than entire industries. The Americans had built entire cities in the desert to refine uranium. They had invented new branches of physics to understand nuclear fission. They had engineered triggers so precise that they could initiate a chain reaction in billionths of a second. They had solved thousands of technical problems, any one of which would have stopped a lesser industrial power completely. And they had done it all in secret, in parallel with fighting a two-front war across 2 oceans, while still producing the conventional weapons, the bombers, the ships, the tanks, the bullets that ground down Axis forces from Normandy to Okinawa. This was abundance weaponized. This was industrial capacity transformed into pure destruction. And the Japanese commanders, surveying the ruins of Hiroshima from reconnaissance photographs, finally understood what they had been fighting all along. Not soft Americans, not undisciplined Democrats lacking the will to sacrifice, but a nation that could harness the fundamental forces of the universe and deploy them with the casual efficiency of a factory production line. The Emperor's voice on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio, the first time most citizens had ever heard his voice. The recording crackled with static, the formal court Japanese nearly incomprehensible to common citizens. But the message was clear. Japan would surrender, unconditionally. In the Imperial Palace, in military headquarters across Japan, commanders wept, some from grief, some from rage, some from sheer exhaustion. A few committed suicide rather than accept the dishonor of defeat. But most simply stood in silence, trying to comprehend how completely their world had changed. General Anami, the war minister who had argued most forcefully for continued resistance, spent his last evening writing letters to his family. Shortly after midnight on August 15th, he knelt in the traditional manner, wrote a final poem apologizing to the emperor for his failure, and committed seppuku, ritual suicide. His last words, spoken to his aide, were, "I do not understand this new world." That incomprehension was shared across the Japanese command structure. They had been prepared for defeat. By the summer of 1945, most senior officers privately acknowledged that Japan could not win the war. They had been prepared for occupation, for the humiliation of foreign troops on Japanese soil, for the trials and recriminations that would follow, but they had not been prepared for obsolescence, for the discovery that their entire military tradition, their warrior ethos, their carefully cultivated spirit of sacrifice, all of it, meant nothing against a weapon that redefined the very nature of warfare. The object that held the sky, in the museum that now stands in Hiroshima, there is a watch. It belonged to a schoolboy named Kazuto Tagawa, who was walking to classes when the bomb detonated. The watch stopped at exactly 8:15 a.m., its mechanism fused by the heat, its face cracked by the shock wave. It is displayed under glass, a small piece of metal and crystal that holds frozen within it the last moment of the old world. Japanese survivors of the bombings speak of time differently than others. They mark their lives as before the flash and after the flash, a division so profound that it reshapes memory itself. What came before? The war, the victories, the defeats, the certainties seems almost dreamlike. A story about different people living in a different universe governed by different laws. And, in a sense, they did. The atomic bomb was not merely a more powerful weapon. It was a threshold crossed, a line drawn between the world where warfare had limits and the world where civilization itself could be ended in an afternoon. The Japanese commanders, trained in the old arts of strategy and tactics, suddenly found themselves inhabitants of a future they had not imagined and could not control. That watch, frozen at 8:15, became their symbol, the moment when time itself split into before and after. The silence of the bunker. On August 16th, the day after the surrender announcement, General Arisue returned to his command bunker north of what had been Hiroshima. He sat at the same desk where he had sat when the telephone line went dead. The barley teacup, long since empty, still sat at his elbow. He picked up the telephone receiver, lines had been restored, and listened to the dial tone, that steady hum of connection and communication. In his pocket was a report from American sources, distributed as part of the early occupation materials. It described the Manhattan Project in broad terms, the scale of effort required to produce the atomic bomb. He read it 3 times, trying to comprehend the numbers. $2 billion, an entire city, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, built solely to refine uranium. Another city, Los Alamos, New Mexico, built to design the weapon. Thousands of scientists, tens of thousands of workers, resources devoted to a single purpose, with a single-mindedness that matched anything Japan had ever attempted. But Japan's single-minded devotion had been to spirit, to will, to the perfection of the warrior ethos. America's single-minded devotion had been to unlocking the atom. Arisue set down the report and looked at his hands. They were steady, unmarked by the war, the hands of a staff officer who had spent most of the conflict moving papers and making telephone calls. He thought about the soldier he had been in 1941, confident and fierce, certain that Japanese discipline and courage would carry the day. He thought about the assumptions he had made, the certainties he had held, the world he had believed in. All of it, he realized, had been built on a foundation of ignorance. Ignorance of what was possible. Ignorance of how thoroughly technology could eclipse training. Ignorance of how completely the rules could change. "We were not defeated," he said aloud to the empty bunker. "We were made irrelevant." The fallout of faith in the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt, as the occupation forces arrived and departed, as democracy took root in the ruins of empire, the survivors of the Japanese High Command struggled to articulate what had happened to them. It was not, they insisted, simply a military defeat. Wars are lost all the time. Armies are destroyed, nations conquered, territories occupied. These are comprehensible disasters, painful but explicable. What happened in August 1945 was different. It was an epistemological crisis, a shattering of basic assumptions about the nature of warfare, power, and human capability. The atomic bomb had not merely defeated Japan, it had rendered the entire framework of Japanese military thinking obsolete before the first bomb even fell. Admiral Toyoda, in his post-war memoirs, wrote, "We built our strategy on the belief that American abundance was a weakness, that their dependence on material comfort made them vulnerable. We believed that our soldiers' willingness to die would overcome their industrial power. We were wrong, but not in the way we thought. It was not that our soldiers lacked courage. They died by the hundreds of thousands with extraordinary bravery. It was that courage had become tactically meaningless. The Americans had found a way to wage war that rendered individual courage irrelevant. This realization, that personal valor, martial spirit, the willingness to sacrifice had been made strategically insignificant by scientific advancement, was perhaps more devastating than the physical destruction. It meant that everything Japan had built its military culture upon, every value it had instilled in generations of soldiers, every tactical doctrine and strategic principle, had been superseded by physics, the democracy of destruction. There was a bitter irony in the weapon that ended the war. The atomic bomb was, in a sense, the most democratic of weapons. It did not discriminate. It did not care about rank or training or courage. General and private, warrior and civilian, the devoted soldier and the skeptical clerk, all were equally vulnerable, equally powerless before the splitting atom. In traditional warfare, there was meaning in military hierarchy. A well-trained soldier had advantages over a conscript. An experienced officer could make decisions that saved lives or achieved objectives. Courage mattered. Skill mattered. The samurai tradition, the warrior code, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of combat, all of it had value because individual capacity influenced outcomes. But against the atomic bomb, none of it mattered. There was no defense, no counter-tactic, no amount of training or courage or strategic brilliance that could mitigate the weapon's effects. It was the ultimate leveler, and in that leveling it carried an implicit message. The age of the warrior was over. The age of the technologist had begun. The Japanese commanders, many of whom came from samurai families, who had been raised on the tales of feudal warriors and studied the classic texts of strategy, felt this loss acutely. They were not just defeated. They were anachronistic, medieval figures suddenly transported into a world where their expertise was obsolete. It was as if the katana-wielding samurai of the 16th century had been confronted with machine guns, only infinitely more so. The question that remains in the underground bunker. General Arisue sat with the telephone receiver in his hand, listening to the dial tone. He thought about the question that had haunted him since that morning in August, when the line went dead. What is the point of courage in a world where cities can be erased by a single bomb? He never found a satisfactory answer. None of them did. The best they could manage was a kind of resignation, an acceptance that the world had changed in ways that made their training, their values, their entire way of understanding conflict obsolete. Some adapted, became advocates for peace, dedicated their post-war lives to ensuring such weapons would never be used again. Others retreated into silence, unable or unwilling to reconcile the warrior code they had lived by with the technological reality that had rendered it irrelevant. But all of them, in their private moments, returned to that same instant, the telephone line going dead, the flash of light that consumed a city, the moment when everything they had believed about warfare, about power, about the meaning of military service, collapsed into ash. The abundance of light, there was one image that captured the transformation. It was that flash, not the mushroom cloud. That came after, a symbol of what had happened. But the flash itself, the initial burst of light more brilliant than the sun, visible from 100 miles away, a photonic tsunami that announced the crossing of a threshold. Japanese soldiers had been taught to fight at night, to move through darkness, to embrace the shadows as tactical advantage. But the atomic bomb had brought a light so absolute that it erased shadows, burned them into stone, turned midday into a noontime brighter than any natural sun. It was American abundance expressed as pure radiance, so much energy, so much power, that it exceeded the capacity of human retinas to process without permanent damage. That light became the symbol of obsolescence. Every time a survivor closed their eyes and saw the afterimage still burned into their vision, they were reminded, the old world is gone. The old certainties are ash. The rules have changed in ways we never anticipated and cannot undo. Epilogue. The watch still frozen. The watch in the Hiroshima Museum still reads 8:15. Thousands of visitors pass it every year. Tourists and students and survivors, all pausing to look at this small artifact of catastrophe. The metal is tarnished now, the crystal clouded with age, but the time remains fixed, 8:15 a.m. August 6, 1945. That moment, when the telephone lines went dead, when Japanese commanders realized that everything they knew about warfare had become obsolete, when a single bomb flattened an entire arsenal and rendered generations of military tradition meaningless. That moment did not end. It continues, frozen like the watch, a perpetual present tense that governs every strategic calculation, every military doctrine, every discussion of warfare in the decades since. The Japanese commanders who were left speechless after Hiroshima were witnessing not just the destruction of a city, but the destruction of an epistemology. They had built their entire military culture on assumptions about courage, will, and the meaning of sacrifice. The atomic bomb revealed those assumptions to be artifacts of a previous age, as obsolete as cavalry charges against machine guns, as irrelevant as swords against artillery. In the end, what silenced them was not the scale of destruction. Japan had endured massive firebombing raids, had seen Tokyo burn, had watched cities reduced to rubble. What silenced them was the realization that quantity had achieved a kind of quality, that American abundance had been transformed into a force that transcended strategy, tactics, and the human qualities they had spent their lives cultivating. The abundance they had mocked, the factories and logistics trains, the million tons of supplies, the industrial capacity to wage war across 2 oceans simultaneously. That abundance had produced something they could not fight, could not strategize against, could not overcome through superior will or deeper sacrifice. It had produced the weapon that ended not just a war, but an entire way of thinking about war. And in that underground bunker, listening to the silence where Hiroshima had been, General Arisue and his fellow commanders confronted a truth as terrible as it was final. In the modern age, the warrior was obsolete. The future belonged not to the brave, but to those who could harness the fundamental forces of nature and deliver them with industrial efficiency. The watch, frozen at 8:15, marks that realization. It is the monument to the moment when courage became insufficient, when spirit became irrelevant, when the old world ended and the atomic age began. And in its stillness, it poses the question that the Japanese commanders could never answer. What is honor worth when the enemy can end civilization before lunch? The silence that followed that question echoes still,